فليتفضل مشكورا.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary General Fazil Abim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Alhamdulillah. Hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Just to make sure that you all can hear me and the sound is loud and clear. I think this is one of those things that if we are actually online, you never know, things may or may not work according to our plan. So I hope that this is loud and clear, right? Secretary General, can you hear me? I
Close it and just make your voice louder.
Oh, okay.
To make that the Zoom can capture your voice.
So okay, got it. Is the
better? Alhamdulillah.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yeah. And hello, testing. So am I on the video now? Actually.
Yes, you are in the video now.
Okay, sorry. So I can start. All right.
Yeah.
Can't wait for things to go back to normal, inshallah. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Alladhi ja'ala al-adla maqsad al-shari'at al-asil. Wassalat wassalamu ala rasulih al-kareem. Li tabligh al-shari'ah wa iqamat al-adl fi al-ahkam. Wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. To all of our friends, in fact, I just heard that, mashallah, Dr. Osman is here. It's a very good old friend, the chair of Imam Al-Ghazali in Malaysia at the Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, ISTAC, at the International University of Malaysia, the president of ABIM, Tuan Faisal, and Secretary General of ABIM, alhamdulillah. Hadirin wa hadirat sekalian, rahimakumullah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Now, I've been asked to basically say a few words at this closing ceremony, and it's an honor to be invited, alhamdulillah. Thank you to this, I'm sure, wonderful conference. It was great to hear the recap just now by the Secretary General. So this is in fact in the morning here in Oxford. So it's just, alhamdulillah, I haven't had my breakfast yet, but had my subuh prayer already. So this is going to be food for thought for myself, first and foremost, and with all you. So I haven't really been able to prepare much except for coming out of Salat. So I hope that the antenna and the satellite dish is, inshallah, very good, connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, in this. And I've been given the topic, cultivating good governance between the Muslim world and the West. And in fact, the original topic that was given was something to do with cultivating good governance and developing national ethos. And I thought that when you mean national ethos here means probably Malaysia in the context of your conference. Although I'm speaking from Oxford, I am of course a Malaysian. But then I suggested perhaps, with the president of ABIM that perhaps, we want to give a bit of although that is a very good intention to think of developing a national ethos. But it would be very good as well for us to think quite critically when we talk about good governance, to also compare and see where this comes from, this notion, this idea of good governance, indeed, particularly to compare it with the so-called West, because we always take for granted, I think. People always use the West as the role model, as the mithal, as the example and the exemplar. But they don't realize sometimes that, in fact, the mithalu sabiq, the precedent, actually is closer to home, in fact. And this is what I want to talk about. And I think it's partly because of our inferiority complex, as Muslims. Particularly when we've lost, political authority in the world, something which we had taken for granted, certainly, 1400 years ago, when Muslims used to rule the world. Muslims used to be the first world, not the third world. Muslims used to be in the golden India during their golden age, the epitome, the mithal, the role model of good governance. Whereas today, and I think this is encapsulated best, I think, in the famous saying, but some ulama actually, quite a number of ulama, if not a lot of ulama, say that this is a mawdu', a fabricated saying of the famous Shaykh al-Azhar, of course, of the late 19th century, i.e. Sheikh Muhammad Abduh, when he said famously, well, this is a saying which is not quite confirmed whether he actually did say it. According to Sheikh Muhammad Imarah, for example, he hasn't found anywhere where Muhammad Abduh had said this. ذهبت إلى الغرب وجدت الإسلام بغير مسلمين ورجعت إلى الشرق وجدت مسلمين بغير الإسلام. So, very famous saying, of course, a tribute to Shaykh Muhammad Abduh. I went to the West and saw it, but no Muslims. I got back to the East and saw Muslims, but no Islam. But, disregarding whatever Shaykh Muhammad Imarah and other of the ulama say, that this is not a saying of Muhammad Abduh. In fact, I in my own particular reading, I found that actually an earlier, quite famous ulama, Imam Rifa' Tahtawi, during the early 19th century, when Muhammad Ali, the famous governor, the Pasha of Egypt, sent him to France. Actually, he said, now this is something that I found in his memoirs to, as an imam spending his time in Paris, he said, Wajatul Islam bighayr muslimin, fi Faransa. I saw Islam in France without Muslims. Wajatul Muslimin fi Misra bighayr Islam. And I saw Muslims in Egypt without Islam. And so that was the saying of Tahtawi, which is confirmed, and I can confirm that, mashallah. But, it doesn't really matter. I think whether Abduh said that or not, when he went to the West, he saw Islam but no Muslims. And when he got back to the East, he saw Muslims but no Islam. But this basically shows the side of inferiority complex in the attitude that we Muslims have, today. And not only during their time, but during the time of Abduh and Tahtawi, but of course today. I mean, the typical example is we would say, for instance, Japanese are cleaner than Muslims today. And people go to Japan, or people who have Japanese friends, they notice that, mashallah, Japanese people are on the whole very clean people. You see, when they compare it to Muslims, sometimes when they say, Muslims not clean. So, and it's an irony, because the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a Sahih hadith, famous hadith, from Al Harith bin Asim Al Ash'ari, this famous hadith, Tuhur Shatrul Iman, right? That cleanliness is a part of our faith. So despite that, we have people saying Japanese are cleaner than Muslims. But why is that? Hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah. I mean, it's symptomatic of the fact that I think when we've lost our adab, when we've lost our civility, when we've lost our sincerity, and we've lost our prosperity, I think I saw the sort of tagline of your conference there. This is what can happen, that you lose confidence of yourself, and then you look to other people, basically from outside of your civilization even, as a reference point. And that's not, it's not surprising. It is quite a natural thing, for that to be the case. But we must remember now that despite Imam Tahtawi going to France, saying that he saw Islam in France with no Muslims, and he saw Muslims in Egypt, but without Islam, we must remember now, in this day and age, Muslims are already, in fact, so I'm one of those Muslims who are in the West, living, staying, and residing, working in the West. This is quite a different world now. It's not as what it used to be before, that there were no Muslims in the West, including Japan, for example, when we include the meaning of the West, Japan here, for instance, in that sense. There are Muslims also in Japan. So I think in this respect, when we talk about cultivating good governance between the Muslim world and the West, I just want to bring this sense that when we try and compare, we want to try and look for something that is actually, an example, a model that we want to try and follow, for instance. And so when we talk about that, I think we should have insaf that, in fact, from the earliest days of Islam, our religion has always taught us good governance. So what is it, ladies and gentlemen? What is the meaning of good governance here? I think it's an interesting question because I don't want to philosophize about this, but I think if you were to try and look up even the dictionary or the encyclopedia reference works about what is the meaning of good governance, among the various things that I've actually read, one that is quite current, I think, would be somebody that I think you want to refer to, particularly from the West, since we're talking about cultivating good governance between the Muslim world and the West, would be the famous political scientist, Francis Fukuyama. So he said, in fact, in one of his writings, he defined what is governance, basically. So what is good governance? And governance, he said, good and bad depends on two things, right? This is Francis Fukuyama saying, number one, depends on the capability of the state, meaning here the capability of the governing body. So in Arabic, we would say quwwah, the ability of basically that one governing body to be able to rule, to be effective, or to project its power, basically. And secondly, he says that good governance or governance, good or bad, is dependent on the bureaucracy's autonomy. Okay? And so this is interesting. I mean, I don't want to go into the details of both the political impact as well as the economic impact of this. He himself, of course, is a political scientist and in political economy. Of course, they go into greater detail about. But it's sufficient for us to reflect on what Francis Fukuyama means by what he thinks is actually good governance, certainly from a Western perspective, from a Western standpoint, that it is the capability of the state to rule, right? And the bureaucracy's autonomy. And here we would be able to interpret the state into other things. If it's a company, then the capability of the board of the company, or the governing body of the company to rule, for instance, and the bureaucracy's autonomy. So the management or the system of that company basically is autonomous. It is, in fact, independent here. And if we were to reflect on that, we would actually, not surprisingly, for me, of course, not surprising, but maybe for a lot of you, you would be surprised to know that, in fact, whether Fukuyama realizes it or not, right? He actually was following, or rather, the criteria of the Quran when we talk about good governance here. What I would call the Mosaic Criteria, which is basically the definition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has informed us as to the criteria describing our Prophet Musa alayhi salam, in the Quran, in Surah Al-Qasas, right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala famously described, famously say through, in this case, the story of the woman when Prophet Musa alayhi salam, Moses, of course, was making his hijrah from Egypt to Palestine, and in the middle of this desert, of course, he was found by this family, and this lady basically described to her father, Inna khayra man istajarta al-qawiyul amin. Right? To employ Nabi Allah Musa. Why? Because he has these two characteristics that will make him not only employable, but in a epitome, in this case, of governance. Name, the best of the one that you can basically make use of in your employment. Inna khayra man istajarta al-qawiyul Alami is the one who has the capability, the professionalism. So this is like what Francis Fukuyama is saying, the capability of the state, the capability of the person, the capability of the company, the core, basically the skill set that you need to actually have, right? But not only that you need to be al-amin, you need to be trustworthy. And that's why it is not a surprising thing that when you sit on a board of a company, for example, you become trustee of that company, even in the modern sense of the word. Al-amin wal-umana, for instance. So it's interesting that even when you become an independent director of a company, for instance, that you have to fulfill according to, the laws of not only in Malaysia, but in the United Kingdom, someone to be employed. Why? Because this person will have good governance. Why? Because if he or she has the skill set, basically the capability, right? As Fukuyama says. But secondly, also well, in the words of Fukuyama, the bureaucracy's autonomy, meaning the person can be trusted. The person is actually independent. So this is the meaning of trustworthy, being trustworthy, basically. This is key. And something which, if we reflect on this, mashallah, Fukuyama's criteria is exactly the sort of, not exactly, but it's comparable and something we can compare with the Mosaic criteria as mentioned in the Quran, of the sense of good governance there. But what is it that, if we want to actually have good governance, what that we want to basically lead to is the bigger question. And I think this is the more important thing for us to ask, ladies and gentlemen. Why do we need good governance? And I think asking that, and if we're looking again, from that verse from Surah Al-Qasas, Inna khayra man ista'jarta al-qawiyyu al-amin. Why is it important for us to have someone who is capable and professional, and at the same time someone who is, trustworthy? Why is it important to be trustworthy here? It's because, at least in my view, and this is something where I'm sure philosophers, political scientists, economists, and ulama and others, of course, will continue to debate. And I believe that part of that means that you need to learn to uphold the rule of law. I think this is a very important mark, why we need to have good governance, why we need to cultivate good governance. It's to uphold the rule of law. And at the root of it, if you look at the meaning of, Fukuyama when he says the bureaucracy's autonomy. So this is a very typical example. Malaysia, for example, is going through, alhamdulillah, part of what I consider a maturing process politically. In Malay, sawa matang or something, I don't know, you're maturing. We are going through our growing pains. I don't know, and I grew up in Malaysia. I remember there was this American sitcom or American comedy. I forgot it was this young guy. Is it Growing Up? I think I can't remember. Maybe I've forgotten the name of it's Growing Pains, Growing Up, or something about a boy growing up, and it's going through your not only your rites of passage religiously, but rites of passage in life. So I don't want to go in detail now, but I think everybody growing up will have to go through this period of growing pains. This process of maturing, and Malaysia is no different as a country. And developing this national ethos means that you actually have to go through this. You actually have to mature yourself. And so we've had for the first time after 60 years, I suppose, in 2018, a change of government, right? And then now, since as my own ruler, the Sultan of Perak, His Royal Highness Sultan Azim Shah mentioned, of course, quite recently in one of his speeches, we've actually had 3 prime ministers in 3 years. So that's quite, I don't know whether to say that's an achievement. It's an achievement of sorts, of course, from one point. But, from another point, from a political stability standpoint, one could argue, this cannot happen too many times, otherwise. But, this is the thing. But what's interesting is that during the times when we had these changes of government, what is it that is supposed to remain constant? Well, it's the bureaucracy. And this is when Fukuyama, he says the bureaucracy's autonomy is, if it's there, it is a mark of good governance, you say, right? And so that's why our civil servants will need to make sure that they carry out their utmost duty to make sure that they become impartial, you see, to serve whichever government of the day is basically ruling. And this, in a sense, is a very Islamic ethos, because why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that already? The capability to rule is one thing, to have the al-qawi, that power, right? But then al-amin. So you have to be trustworthy. You have to be true to not only yourself in this, but true in the system that you are basically put there, to make sure that you carry out your duties there, because this is what the civil servants are supposed to do. So I hope you can see, somebody, if we get the chance to see Francis Fukuyama, and say, well, what you say about governance, good or bad, depends on these two things: the capability, the power of the state, and the bureaucracy's autonomy. Actually, is a very Quranic inspired, mashallah, insight, right? And this is what we see now in Malaysia. If the civil service is not autonomous, if it is not independent, then the bureaucracy will not be able to actually, be efficient in running the state, you see. So I think, given that we see that, it is particularly important that we understand, therefore, the whole reason why we need to cultivate good governance is why, in this case, the civil servants need to uphold the rule of law, right? It is what we say in the Malaysian national context, of course, from our Rukun Negara, Kedaulatan Undang-Undang, right? And it is for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, hadirin wa hadirat sekalian, rahimakumullah. I truly believe that because Islam had brought these basic, if you like, building bricks that had made the Islamic civilization once upon a time, during their golden age, of course, the first world. They were not the third world. They were the light of the world. The Dark Ages was in Europe at that time. These are the sorts of values that were taught by our religion through the Quran, through the word of Allah, and through the teachings and the Sunnah of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is through the teaching of upholding the rule of law, the idea that we need to follow the Sharia there, right? The idea of kedaulatan undang-undang, gave rise to constitutionalism, basically. And this is absolutely important. And it is for this reason, hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah, it is not a surprise that the very first dua, in fact, recited at the Merdeka of 1957, right? That was during His Majesty. Then was, these people always forget. We have Tengku Abdul Rahman, who was our first Prime Minister. But don't forget, our first His Majesty ke bawah Duli Yang Maha Paduka Seri Paduka Yang di-Pertuan Agong was actually from Negeri Sembilan. So his name was also Abdul Rahman, but his Tuanku Abdul Rahman. And those of us who come from Perak, those of you who come from Perak, so I just want to be, fair here, and no Ipoh, right? So there's a call called STAR, Sekolah Tuanku Abdul Rahman, not Tengku Abdul Rahman, right? Just don't confuse the two. But it's one of the most amazing thing about being, mashallah, Malaysians in this case, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, what a blessed country. The first king and the first prime minister share the same name, just except one is Tuanku and the other one is Tengku. So anyway, because the first king is basically from Negeri Sembilan, it was not a surprise that the Mufti who read the dua, to declare, at the ceremony, to declare Merdeka, when Tuanku Abdul Rahman was there, right, was the Mufti of Negeri Sembilan, right, Sheikh Ahmad bin Muhammad Said. Right, and what was his dua? It was an amazing dua, and something we should be learning, and to cultivate good governance. And I don't want to be in this inferiority complex mindset anymore, that we think that everything in the West is so great. Well, we don't even have to go back to the Quran I've now pointed, but at least even you can go to the dua of Merdeka of 1957. Look at the dua of Mufti Ahmad bin Muhammad Said. What was his dua? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma waffiq صائر العمال والوزراء والسلاطين والأمراء لرعاية أمور الدين. Right? اللهم وفق. Oh Allah, give success to whom? These are the four people, or at least, I know you gave five, but I just want to shorten it to four. Wafiq صائر العمال. Umal, what is the meaning of umal in Arabic? If you don't know, civil servants. The bureaucracy. Give success to the, and in his dua, he was the first one. The first category of people mentioned in the dua of Mufti Ahmad bin Muhammad Said, right? In 1957, the Stadium Merdeka was give success, give tawfiq to the bureaucrats. Why? Because they have to be autonomous. They have to be, they have to, they have to perform their duty basically, and to uphold the rule of law, to menegakkan kedaulatan undang-undang tu. And then who? Wuzara, perhaps people like myself. I mean, not wuzara meaning advisors, right? Ministers, advisors. I'm not an minister, but wuzara to kings, advisors, to rules, advisors to the leaders, wuzara, right? And number 3, Salatin, to the rulers, to the sultan. Because technically, the prime minister is one of the wazir of the sultan in our system. Right? The prime minister is an advisor to the king. Right? And here in Malaysia, we are not unique because we follow the Westminster system, but Malaysian style, the UK is also like that. Right? The Queen, of course, is served by the Prime Minister. So technically, the Prime Minister advises the Queen, formally at least, right? Although, in fact, in that constitutional monarchy, just like in Malaysia, the power actually does reside with, of course, the cabinet and the executive, certainly. And then number 4, he goes and actually says Salatin wal muluk, so I'll combine that. But number 4, wal umara. So give success, give tawfiq ya Allah to all of our leaders, right? Li ri'ati umuridi, in order to protect the affairs of our way of life, of our deen, wal muhafazati ala hukuk muslimin, and to protect, right, the rights, to rise fil ahkam, and to uphold basically the rule of law, and to menegakkan kedaulatan undang-undang. By what? By making keadilan itu tegakkan. Wa iqamatil adli fil ahkam. This is literally what it means there, is that to prop up al-adl, right? To prop up keadilan fil ahkam, all the rulings, meaning all the laws, etc., etc. So what it means is this is the meaning of upholding the rule of law. It comes from the dua of Mufti Ahmad bin Muhammad Sa'id during the Merdeka. This is the meaning of kedaulatan undang-undang, right? And this is the very important part of his dua. And of course, he ends. He then continues with "Wa tamasuki bi fadailil Islam," and to stay firm to the good values, of Islam, the fadilah and the fadail of our religion, such as cultivating governance. Yeah. So, hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah, I think it's important for me to share with you, I think, this sense that, good governance, why do we need it? It's because we want to, at the root of it, philosophically, at the root of it means that we need to learn to uphold the rule of law. This is the basic message of the Quran, basically. This is why I started my khutbah just now by saying that the al-adl, keadilan itu adalah, maqsad, the original objective, maqsadul al-asil of our Sharia. How many hundreds of verses talk about upholding justice in the Quran? Meaning there, the context of it is to uphold the rule of law. That was why when we were the first world, we were the land of the free, right? The non-Muslims in those days, whether in Central Asia, they were enemies, or whether even in Europe, they were Christians, right? But they were not land of the free. They were living in zaman kegelapan. Why? Because look at the Byzantine Empire, compare it with the Abbasids, for example, the Abbasiya, Khilafah. They couldn't even build mosques and synagogues in their land. They only allowed churches to be built. Whereas next door, in Muslim lands, mashallah, you can build not only masjid, but, churches, synagogue, Hindu temples, Buddhist, Hindu ashram, Buddhist temples, and so on and so forth. Subhanallah. So who was in the land of the free in those days? If you don't believe this sense, well, then just go and watch the HBO famous kind of, during the COVID lockdown, particularly in the US, when in a country with a culture where people actually do not like to watch subtitle movies, let alone series, 5 seasons, 500 episodes of Ertugrul. Ertugrul, I think the Malaysians might say, but the real, in Turkish, Ertugrul. Who was what? The father of Sultan Osman, the first, the founder, the founder to the Ottoman state, the Ottoman Caliphate. Just look at that. I mean, you can see in person, wow, how when you live with Ertugrul, right, it's the land of the free compared to the Byzantine lands where you really have no freedom. This is what I mean here. Why? Why is this possible? Because of the message of the Quran. Al-adlu maqsudu syariatil asil. That keadilan, that justice, upholding justice, basically upholding the rule of law, that's what it means, is basically an original objective of our sacred life, of our sharia. And this is something that we must not forget. That is why Mufti Ahmad bin Muhammad Said said in his beautiful dua that we must learn for our citizens, to learn to pray for the four categories of people: the bureaucrats, the advisors, and the ministers and the prime ministers, if you like, to the kings, right? To our kings, and these are who? All of these are our leaders, basically, including the bureaucrats. That they need to iqamatil adli fil ahkam. That they need to make sure that Allah give tawfiq for them so that they learn to uphold the rule of law, and that is absolutely very, very important. But hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah. I mean, I've said this is the national ethos on the Malaysian side, which we had to go back to, go back to basics there. But actually, this is a very old thing, this rise of constitutionalism, from this upholding the rule of law. It is an old idea. Of course, in the West, the most famous idea, of course, is what? The Magna Carta. That was promulgated in the year 1215 in the 13th century. Now, if it is in the Western tradition, when people talk about the importance of the rule of law, they go back to the Magna Carta. What do they mean by this, by the way? Magna Carta, I'm sure you all know what it means. It's from the Latin magna, great, kabir, right? Carta is akad, perjanjian. Now, the Western people are so proud of this. I remember having to speak at the conference here in the UK about at the anniversary in 2015. It was, sorry, my maths is very bad. 2015 minus 1215. So my wife's not here for me to ask now. Is it 700th anniversary? I don't know, Secretary General, you can help me. 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta? I don't know. Sorry. What, is it 800 or 900th anniversary? Anyway, okay. So, but so in the West, they celebrate the Magna Carta. Why? Because it is an emblem when King John masa tu was the ruler here. He was an absolute ruler, and he tried to project himself as the absolute ruler. But the nobles, the orang-orang besar, of England masa tu, checked him and said, no, you have to have check and balance, right? You have to have check and balance. You cannot be a despot there, and that's why. Basically, Magna Carta became famous. It is the first titik permulaan of the rise to constitutionalism in England. Right? Now, we should be proud, hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah, especially as Malaysians, especially as the anak Nusantara, Muslims in the Nusantarans must be proud. Why? Because we also have our Magna Carta tradition, actually. In our tradition, not just an Islamic tradition, but a very Malay tradition, actually. You know why? Because if you look at Sejarah Melayu, the famous, one of the great books of the Malay world, written by Tun Sri Lanang in 1615, he wrote about this famous perjanjian, right? Which he called what? Wa'ad. First from the Arabic, wa'ad. Wa'ad, perjanjian, between who? Sang Sapurba, meaning on the ruler or the king side, and Demang Lebar Daun, right? Meaning on the noble side, the baron side. So what was the perjanjian? The basic, I don't want to go into detail. It's 2 pages long. You can read the whole thing. The gist of it is, Raja adil, Raja disembah, Raja zalim, Raja disanggah. That's the gist of it. That's the kind of the sumpah, if you like, And it was quite an amazing thing. And from that, we get the word daulat, by the way, in Malay, It's like barakah, that the Malaysians kedaulatan undang-undang, which is normally used for daulat tuanku, right? The power to the ruler there. Long live the king, right? Daulat tuanku. But, from that story, you can see this daulat is linked to a social contract, because the Magna Carta, is a social contract in 1215 between King John and his barons and his orang besar. The same also with Sang Sapurba and Demang Lebar Daun, right? As recounted by Tun Sri Lanang in Sejarah Melayu. In the 17th century in 1615, right? So, well, I may have got the date wrong. Setelah it could be 1612 or something like that, but thereabouts anyway in the 17th century. But it is a social contract, reminding us that the ruler must make sure, the king must make sure, the government must make sure, the state must make sure that they do what? They uphold justice as what Allah says in the Quran. In return, the rakyat, the subjects, would obey, ta'at, daulat tuanku, right? Memang besarlah, something like, I can't remember the exact phrase, daulat tuanku, etc., 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 So you please go back to Sejarah Melayu and read this wonderful story. But the point that I want to make here is that it is a social contract that led to this, right? And this whole idea of Raja Adil, Raja disembah, Raja Zalim, Raja disanggah, absolutely. It is a contract that we should be proud of in the Malay world. This is our own makna karta. That's why I can confidently say, hadirin muhadirat sekalian rahimakumullah, this is the wa'ad in the Sejarah Melayu, but the wa'ad kabir. For us, politically, the wa'ad kabir. Truly, the magna carta of the Nusantara. Truly, the great contract. The great social contract. MashaAllah. MashaAllah. I mean, and to make more tafakkur, more reflections on this. I mean, I'm reminded of this very nice saying, which a lot of Malays, unfortunately today, especially misunderstand. Biar mati anak, jangan mati adat. Right? And we're talking about the Negeri Sembilan here. I'm Perakhian just to show how independent, autonomous I can be here, right? So separation of powers, in this case. So, this is the thing. When we talk about adat, you always remember Negeri Sembilan. That's the thing, right? And then people always, when they talk about adat, they always think adat is like adat resam, like bila nak kahwin, like tak boleh langkah bendul sort of thing. I'm not sure what that means even. So, I think if your eldest is, belum kahwin lagi, you shouldn't get married. Fine. I mean, we should respect that if that is not against the teachings of Islam to the best of our ability, of course, But the problem is that the Malaysians or the Malays speaking Malaysians and the Malays, they really should understand actually adat is not just adat resam, not just hantar bila nak kahwin bagi bunga rampai and all this, and that's not the cultural aspect of adat limited to only that. Adat is much bigger than that. Adat in fact means law actually, because it comes from the Arabic adat, which means law, the norms of society, Al-adatu muhakkamah in Arabic from the Qaeda, among the ulama. So norms of society is the basis for the law. This is from our Sharia. The 5 cardinal principles of the Sharia itself, agreed by all 4 madhab of the Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'ah, among the Shafi'is, the Hanafis, the Malikis, and the Hanbalis. Al-adatu muhakkamah, for instance. So the original meaning of adat is actually law, how we live our lives. It's just that for some reason, that meaning of law, which is big, it became more restricted and more narrowed down to just cultural practice, unfortunately. And why? My proof is very simple of this. Biar mati anak, jangan mati adat. The origins of this, if you do not know, the provenance of this is actually from Sultan Iskandar Muda, the famous ruler of Aceh. Actually, during the time when Tun Sri Lanang wrote his book Sejarah Melayu. And in fact, in 1615, right? Now I remember why I said 1615 earlier. Sorry. He wrote a letter to the famous letter to King James I. And we have this letter here in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I looked at it myself. Wonderful letter, preserved here, in 1615. So this was the ruler of Aceh, right? Ruler from the Nusantara who wrote to King James I, right? King James, of course, famous in the UK, in British culture and British history, because he was the king who basically commissioned the Bible to be retranslated, and it became the King James Bible. It became macam, I don't know, like the Bible in the standard English language lah, something like that. Like, I don't know, kalau ada macam bahasa Melayu, Quran ni translation apa, standard, like Tafsir Pimpinan Rahman or something like that, right? I don't know. So, something like a, authorized English version of the Bible or something like that. So, so this ruler, Sultan Iskandar Muda, right? He had a son. His crown prince was caught, in committing an act of crime, basically, and the punishment for that crime is death. And when his wazir, his advisors, his menteri came to him, or his prime minister, whatever, said to, scared to say this, but he didn't even scared to say this. Maybe the king, the sultan was saying, "You seem agitated. Is there anything there?" Yes, there's a tiny weeny bit problem. Your son committed crime that has the death penalty, and this is the Sultan Iskandar Muda basically said, well, if this is proven to be true that he committed this crime, then biar mati anak, jangan mati adat. Let even, when we speak, as the Quran says, famously, right? Speak truth, even if, uphold justice, even if it is against yourself and your family, basically. This is a Quranic message. This is what Sultan Iskandar Muda was being true to. Biar mati anak, jangan mati adat. So let no one ever dispute anymore, including any prime ministers or anything, because I heard some rumors, somebody saying that, one of our former prime ministers that actually said that actually, this adat, biar mati anak, jangan mati adat is a useless saying or something like that. It's a kalam kuno or something which has no meaning. Excuse me, this is wrong. You need to go back to the original meaning of adat there, meaning law. So even if our own family commit crime, we have to uphold the rule of law. And because the ruler has to be autonomous in this case, it's not only important for him to be capable, as the Quran says, al-qawi, but he has to be al-amin, trustworthy. He has to be autonomous, independent. Even if his son committed a crime, the crown prince no less. I'm sorry, the death penalty. And this is what happened in Aceh. Just read the story. If you don't believe me, just go and go. And that's why we have the saying, biar mati anak, jangan mati adat, right? And hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah. If we are amazed by this, then don't be amazed any longer when we must realize that actually this biar mati anak, jangan mati adat actually goes back the original provenance. The basis of this is from the sunnah of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who brought mercy to the worlds, to both the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world, to both the world of mankind, human beings, humanity, and the world of the jinns and aliens and whatnot that you have out there. Right? And this is an amazing thing. Because why? The Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in a hadith which is sahih, narrated by Urwah bin Zubair, narrated in Sahih Bukhari, in Sahih Muslim, and so on and so forth, right? Where he himself, the Prophet himself said, Lau an Fatima binti Muhammad sarakat laqata tuha yada. Lau, dalam Arabic ni, in Arabic, lau is the hypothetical if, meaning it's never going to happen. It's only hypothetically we can use it in a class like this, in a lecture, just to hypothesize. Lau, if my own daughter, basically, if Fatima binti Muhammad stole something, committed the crime of stealing when she has no hunger or anything, and she's, no other mitigation there, but, really still stole something, like many of these Hollywood films that you see people just stealing for the sake of wanting to steal, because they can live their lives. They don't need to, steal to live their life anymore, but they really steal out of the gratuity, basically. Right? If she, Fatima binti Muhammad, radiallahu anha, stole something, I myself will cut off her hands. This is the sabda of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Subhanallah. So Sultan Iskandar Muda was basically following the sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in a sense, this whole rise of constitutionalism, this whole rise of the ethos, right? The value, the good value of upholding the rule of law basically comes from Islam. This is why Islam was the first world in those days, during the Golden Age. We were the light to the world. We were the land of the free, the America of those days, the land of the free in those days, to bring law to the rest of the world, mashallah. So that's why even the Byzantines had Roman law, but they didn't allow mosques to be open, synagogues to be open. They were not that free. But mashallah, next door, they were free. And that's why this is one of the most amazing, facts there. So I want to just finish off by, saying that, I hope it's clear for you then, the whole point about having good governance is basically to uphold the rule of law, right? And why? Because this is part of the reason And this is because to uphold justice, iqamatul adl fil ahkam, in order to put justice uppermost. This is what made our religion so famous once upon a time. And part of that, I would say, upholding the rule of law, of course. But if we want to benefit particularly from the way the Western tradition have actually expressed this, is to have the separation of powers. For why? For the check and balance. It's okay if we have people like Sultan Iskandar Muda as a role model, where he himself has Al-Amin alongside Al-Qawi, so he himself will check himself, right? But the reality, in a very flawed world where we have human beings who a lot of tamak, haloba, and ego and nafs and so on and so forth, you need to have other people check and balance against you. That's why you have the Magna Carta in 1215. You have the nobles, the barons checking the power of the king to make sure the king does not rule with zalim, in tyranny. The same way with Sang Sapurba dengan Demang Lebar Daun. Sang Sapurba was the king. Demang Lebar Daun was the nobleman who basically gave his fealty, his daulat tuanku to Sang Sapurba, but with the condition that justice will be, that you carry out the justice there. And we will check that against you. And this is the reason why I as a Perakhian, I'm proud, I just found out, by the way, after this, maybe you'll have a change of powers. I'm just joking, by the way. But both the president of ABIM and the secretary general of ABIM are both Perakhians. Wow. Okay, it's no monopoly here. But I hope that doesn't mean that your chances for you, or if you have election or something, you may be thrown out of power after this. Sorry, guys. But as Perakhians, we are proud. Why? Because the Perak system is such that when it was founded, the Perak state was founded in 1538, right? The Sultan Muzaffar Shah, the first, was the son of the last king of Malacca, right, Sultan Mahmud, who had to be exiled in Sumatra, in Kampar, when the Portuguese invaded Malacca. And, when he was first invited, basically, by Tun Saban, one of the barons of Perak in South Perak, in Hile Perak, and Hulu Perak, there's another noble woman, basically, Tok Temong. This is the wonderful thing about Perak. I jokingly say, actually quite seriously, we should say, Perak punya patron saint, Wali Allah is a lady, Tok Temong, Masya Allah, at Hulu Perak. These are two siblings of they were anak of the famous Bendahara Melaka Tun Perak. That's why the Bendahara famous, the famous chancellor or prime minister of Melaka, Tun Perak, was known as Tun Perak very likely because in a feudal system, in those days, of course, that means you ruled the area of Perak, basically. So that's why his children, both the brother and the sister, the sister was ruling the north of Perak, and the brother was ruling the south of Perak, right? So Tun Saban basically was sent to Kampar, to Sumatra, to invite Sultan Mahmud to come back, to the peninsula, Tanah Melayu, because the Portuguese have just invaded Malacca years ago, in 1511. This was in 1538 or whatever it was, about 17 years later or something like that. Oh, but they haven't ventured out of their city-state, Malacca. So we still rule in Perak, and Johor is still in, etc. So come back, it's the successor state to Malacca, etc. So he basically, Sultan Mahmud didn't want to do this himself, but sent his son, Sultan Raja Muzaffar Shah. And so Raja Muzaffar became the first king of Perak in 1538. I may have got the date wrong, 38 or 28, but there you go, thereabouts. Sorry if it is wrong. This is the problem when you don't prepare for your talk. Sorry about that, guys, folks. So anyway, so when he went to the peninsula, this is the, when he met basically Tok Temong, in Perak. This is the famous story, right, among Perakians. And Tok Temong gave this mustika embun, right? This kind of magical dew, as it were, very mystical kind of, petrified dew as part of the state regalia of Perak, that we will therefore support you, Your Royal Highness, Raja Muzaffar Shah, provided that you take care of the needs of the people there, to uphold justice, etc., etc. Going back to that Wa'ad Kabir in sejarah Melayu between Sang Sapurba dengan Demang Lebar Daun, going back to that Magna Carta in 1215 of King John and his barons. And that is why in Perak, until today, they form a Dewan Negara, right, which is basically a council of the barons, council of the orang-orang besar, to always advise the ruler. So the parent ruler can never, in that sense, even when he one day he dies, when any parent ruler dies, it is this council that elects the next ruler. It's a bit like in Negeri Sembilan, you have the four undangs, So it's not automatic that the anak, the son, will succeed. That's why the ruler has to behave to make sure that, to make sure that I'm in the good books of the orang-orang besar, in a sense. But this is the check and balance system, that separation of powers. Very interesting, mashallah. So, and I want to say this because it's important that we realize, especially in the modern context, it's important to have the separation of powers. Why? Because, if you come from the United States, especially the famous example of the role model of democracy today, even though it is suspect in the last few years, particularly during the Trumpian era, as it were, but still, nevertheless, you learn there is the first estate, which is the executive. There is the second estate, which is what? The legislature. The third estate, which is the judiciary, right? So these three branches of government are co-equal in the American doctrine. And why? Because there needs to be this separation of powers. You need to have the check and balance between the executive, the powers of the executive, and the power of the legislature, and the power of the judiciary. So, bidang kehakiman nombor 3, bidang menyambat undang-undang nombor 2, dan bidang yang ada kuasa untuk manage the country lah, nombor 1, which is the executive. And some say the fourth estate is the media, to have a free media, basically to be able to have to make sure that you report things truly, so that there can be accountability, in all that. But what's interesting, hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah, is that of course America thrives on this system, famously, and in fact, but in areas, in countries where we have constitutional monarchies like Malaysia. Malaysia is a constitutional monarchy. It is a democracy, of course. It has a parliamentary democracy. But like the United Kingdom, Malaysia, the same, Westminster system, but Malaysian style, mashallah, we have a king. And we have the rulers here. And they are not absolute rulers. Our kings are not absolute rulers. They do not rule like King John ruled before, So, but they are constitutional monarchs like King John after the Magna Carta, right? After the Perjanjian Demang Lebar Daun dengan Sangsa Purba, after the first Sultan of Perak, basically. So the king himself must follow the rule of law. This is what it means with the rise of constitutionalism. But what's interesting out of this separation of powers is that, and I say this to, our ruler, His Royal Highness Sultan Azim Shah, for example, my wise and generous patron, I would say, it's, you guys, I said, Your Royal Highness, Duli Tongku, you are in fact the zero estate. You're not the first estate, you're not the second estate, you're not the third estate. Indeed, the king, the agong, the ruler of a state, for example, is the progenitor of the first estate, because our king agong lante, in fact, chooses and lante the prime minister according to our constitution. Our king opens the parliament, right? And our king basically is the fount of justice. So from that point of view, you are the asal. You should be, you oversee. You can't, that's why you are the payung negara. You are the zero estate, essentially. Right? This is the situation where you are basically the bedrock for the country in that respect. And you are the ultimate check and balancer in that particular system. So I jokingly say with my friends in Oxford, among those who teach PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics, among the professors who teach politics, say, wow, and this is true, by the way. And a presidential democracy is not as stable as constitutional monarchy when you're democracy. And of course, I'm not thinking of Malaysia, of course. I'm thinking of the 4 or 3 countries in the Economist Democracy Index list where they are the top 5, So you have countries like Norway and Sweden. These are all countries with kings, by the way, and the Netherlands, So, they are much more stable democracies than a presidential system. Because of this, we have the zero estate, basically. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. So we, go check the Economist, Democracy Index that they have this annually, So a lot more of the countries that are democratic countries that has a king as a constitutional monarch is, that results in a far more stabler democracy. And may we make dua that inshallah, Malaysia one day will rise up to our aspirations to rise up that time, because we have the ingredients already. We have a constitutional monarch monarchical system here in our parliamentary democracy, mashallah. So, hadirin wa hadirat sekalian rahimakumullah, this is really all that I have to say. Cultivating good governance between, the Muslim world and the West. Somewhere where I started off by quoting, that mawdu' saying of Abduh, or the real saying of Imam Tahtawi, I saw in the West Islam but no Muslims, and I saw in the East there are Muslims but there is no Islam. And that is born out of our inferiority complex. It is high time that we need to reclaim back our original values so that we can stand shoulders to shoulders, among our Western compatriots, basically, and be proud of the fact that our religion, mashallah, Islam, through Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, have brought civilization to the world. And in fact, these very modern good governance values, really. Because why? Al-Adl, upholding justice, is the maqsadu shari'at al-asil, is the original objective of our sharia, original objective, our sacred law, indeed. And the maqsad of ikamatul adl, right? The objective of upholding justice is what? Is to create a thriving society, right? This is important. We need to remember that. Because if you have poverty, right, in any society, then by definition, that is not an Islamic society. If you have poverty in a society, then by definition, that is not an Islamic society. That's the whole point of why we want to uphold justice. That is the whole point of why we want to uphold the rule of law, so that we all, can live equitably in this society. Right? And that we strive, even as economists, as leaders, policy makers, as ulama, to try and bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. That's the whole point. So if you have any poverty in society, that means, then by definition, it's not really a true Islamic society. And that's key, and that's very important. And that's why I want to end with this dua of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from, Abu Hurairah, as he narrated in Abu Dawud. He says in this beautiful dua, and this is a dua that we must teach this to our leaders, to our rulers, to our pemimpin, and to our ministers, to the advisors, to the rulers and the prime ministers, and to the bureaucrats, to the civil servants. Allahumma inna na'udhbika min al-faqri wal qillati wal dillati. وَنَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْ أَنْ أَظْلَمَ أَوْ أُظْلَمَ. Right? It's a beautiful dua of the Prophet ﷺ. It's a beautiful dua, and I hope this encapsulates my meandering tafakkur reflections, this afternoon and this morning, really. Oh Allah, jauhkanlah kami, protect us from poverty, from qillah, from hardness and hardship in life, and from living in humiliation, basically. And how do we achieve that? وَنَعُوذْ بِكَ مِنْ أَنْ أَظْلَمَ أَوْ أُظْلَمَ. And how do we achieve not to have poverty, not to live in humiliation, and not to live through hardship, in this material life, basically? How? To make sure that we do not transgress other people. We do not create injustice in this world. So we ask Allah to protect us from being a zalim person, and to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from being transgressed, being mazlum as well, from being orang yang ditindas. And it's a beautiful dua of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a wonderful dua of the Prophet. In this dua, I believe, is where you really have the true answer to cultivating good governance, to develop our national ethos, and to, put it in our heart to see, in fact, how we can actually cultivate good governance between the Muslim world and the West. So that's all I have to say, really. I know my time is up, exactly an hour, and I don't like to go beyond that. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب. I hope this has been, inshallah, beneficial, Secretary General. I hope the volume is loud and clear, and the video also is loud and clear, inshallah. Right? So I turn over to you now. So, we can
Alhamdulillah, jazakallah khairan jaza. ونفعنا به وبعلومه في دارين. Amin. Inshallah. Thank you very much, Sheikh Dr. Afifi Al-Akiti, for your insightful speech. It's very wonderful. But we have to realize your promise just now, and let us open the floor for two questions. So the first one from Al-Fadil Professor Muhammad Fauzan Nordin from IIUM, and also the Chief of Tripartite. Please, Dr. Fauzan, unmute. Yes.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih. Thank you very much, Saudara Fazril, Datuk Dr. Afifi Al-Kiti. Alhamdulillah, glad to hear again your wisdom words all the way from Oxford. Okay, theoretically, historically, Alhamdulillah, MashaAllah, we can see the story of Ituru and Iskandar Muda of Aceh. But unfortunately, I want to bring back to reality what we are having right now. You can, even though you are in Oxford, I think you are monitored closely from there, that what we are facing here, far from, I'm not sure about 50% or 70% of it. What's wrong with us? Is this because of Umara? Is it because of ulama? Is it because of Jundia? Qiyadah wa Jundia? What's wrong with us? We have the